Hey kids, it's Papa. You ready to explore the Bible? Yes, I'm still sick, and sorry this is late, but better late than never, huh? Hey, take the Bibles and turn with me to Second Kings chapter 6. Second Kings chapter 6. Now you remember how that on Wednesday we talked about the fact that Ben-Hadad, the king, had sent his armies down to try and uh, kill the army of Israel, and that Elisha had told the king of Israel where to move his army, so he couldn't find them, and so then he sent them to try and kill Elisha, and by doing that, eliminate the ability of the king of Israel to move his armies around. But you remember what happened. Um, God blinded the soldiers, and one of the things that we should have talked about on Wednesday that we didn't was what Elisha said to his servant. And his servant said, "Look at all of the terrible, host of the army. The bad guys are going to kill us. Oh, this is overwhelming." And Elisha said, "Lord, open his eyes." And the Lord opened his eyes. And he pointed out that they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And what we need to learn from that is that even when things are dark and terrible and we don't see any way to go, God has a plan and He has His pieces in place, ready to play them. And, you know, there's going to be a lot of times in your life when you think, I don't see a way out. But rest assured that God does, and His way is always perfect. Well, after they were blinded and then sent back, those soldiers never came back down into Israel. But Ben-Hadad raised another army and he came down and he besieged Samaria. Now, let's talk a little bit about a siege. A siege is when an army surrounds a city and rather than attacking it and trying to take it, they simply weaken it by not allowing any food or water or anything to come into the city. Now, the city's made up of a whole lot of people that have to eat, animals that have to eat, and they have to drink. And a lot of times these cities were built on water sources. So a lot of times water wasn't the problem, it was food. And eventually you get hungry. And then what happens is the price of food starts going up and up and up and up in the city. And the next thing you know, um, there's riots and there's people doing terrible things because when you get hungry, many times you do some stupid things. And so we see that's what was happening in Samaria. Now, many times these sieges would be just to weaken them, and then once they were weakened, they would attack, and the soldiers wouldn't be able to, to fight back. But many times these sieges were like a year, 2 years long, and sometimes they would try and send messengers to other cities to try and bring soldiers in to attack the besiegers so that they. There were a lot of things that went on, and every time it worked out a little bit differently. But we find here that things were really getting bad. And you can tell they were getting bad by what happened. Now take a look in Second Kings chapter 6, verse 6. It says, and it came to pass that after this, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered his host and went up and besieged Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria. And behold, they besieged it until an ass's head was sold for fourscore pieces of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dung of dove's dung for a piece of silver. Now, you say, what's that talking about? Okay, how much meat is there on a donkey's head? Not a lot of meat there. And yet still it was being sold for fourscore pieces of silver. Now think about that. Not four pieces of silver, fourscore. In other words, 80 pieces of silver just for a donkey's head. Okay, and a cab of dove's dung. I don't know how big a cab was, but they would use this for fuel and for other things, and it was sold for 5 pieces of silver. That is expensive. Um, and so the king was just distraught. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to save his people. Um, and so he goes out for a walk on the wall, and as he's passing by, a woman cries out to him and says, notice in verse 26, it says, "Help, my lord, O king." In verse 27, he says, "And if the Lord will not help thee, whence shall I help thee? Out of the barn floor or out of the winepress?" He says, "I've got nothing. I got no way to help you." And he says, "What's wrong?" And she said, "This woman." Okay, apparently she had a neighbor lady. She said, "This woman said, 'Give me thy son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.'" Now, how hungry do you have to be to eat anyone? Okay, to get into cannibalism. And more importantly, how hungry would you have to be willing to eat your own son? Well, apparently she did. They boiled this woman's son and ate him. And then she said, on the next day, "Give me thy son, that we may eat him today." And so we boiled my son. Oh, yeah, verse 29. Um, she went and hid him. The other lady, she said, "Well, I had a big meal yesterday, so I don't need to eat my son today." So she hid her son. And so this other lady is all upset. She says, "I'm hungry, and I want to eat this other lady's son." And the king was like, "Oh, this is terrible to think that my kingdom has come to this." And then he got angry. And when you get angry, you want to lash out at someone. Now, who was he going to lash out at? Well, it was obviously, that the Lord could be stopping it, but he's not. But how do you attack the Lord? He couldn't attack the Lord, so he attacks the Lord's prophet. Okay, he says in verse 31, then he said, "God, do so more to me, if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, shall stand on him today." He says, "I'm going to behead the prophet of God." Now, we need to be very careful, because there are a lot of times when we get upset with God and we then turn on other people. Don't do that. First of all, don't get upset with God. If God is judging you, then you need to turn back to God and say, "Lord, what am I doing wrong?" Okay? Um, and so, honestly, this is what we ought to do. But there's another lesson we need to learn here. There are times when other people get angry with God's representatives, and they attack God's representatives when they're really angry at God. And a lot of times as a pastor, I found this. People would attack me, and I had to remember they're not attacking me, they're trying to attack God through me, and I'm just the one that they're turning their anger upon, even though it's not me. And so you and I need to be careful. When we get angry at God, we need to not be angry at God. Because the problem is never God. Okay, you understand that? The problem is never God, it's us. Okay? And so when we are tempted to get angry at God, we need to stop and say, "Wait a minute here. The problem is never God. The problem is me." And when other people get angry at us, sometimes we need to realize they're not angry at us, they're angry at God, and they're just misplacing their anger. So we need to remember this. A lot of times people misdirect their anger. And if you ever start to get angry with God, remember the problem is never God. The problem is me. Okay? Hey, love you guys. Talk to you later.